County Mayo, Ireland, September 1846. A woman kneels in a field that fed her family for a generation and pulls up a potato that has turned to black slime in her hand. The smell is the first sign. Then the stalks collapse. Then the whole field, and the next, and the one after that. By the time this blight finishes its work, roughly 1 million people in Ireland will be dead. Another million will flee across the Atlantic, crammed into ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that sailors call them coffin ships. Ireland's population will fall by a quarter, and it will never fully recover, not in 180 years. This is not just a story about a crop failure. It's the story of how a single root vegetable, dug out of the Andes thousands of years ago, ended up so deeply tangled into the fate of empires that when it died, nations shook. This is the history of the potato, the plant that fed the rise of Europe, and then starved one of its own, and then went on to feed the modern world anyway. To understand how we got to that field in Mayo, we have to go back further, about 8,000 years further, to a mountain range where farmers were solving a problem no one else in the world had solved yet. How do you grow food at 14,000 feet, where the air is thin, the frost comes without warning, and the soil itself seems to resent you? We're going to trace the potato from a wild, bitter Andean tuber to the single most important vegetable in European history, and then to Ireland, where dependence on this one plant turned into the deadliest famine in 19th century Europe and helped light the fuse under British rule itself. Along the way, poison, propaganda, a French queen with potato flowers in her hair, and an empire that never saw the crisis coming until it was already dying in the fields. The potato story begins in the highlands of what is now Peru and Bolivia, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. Wild potatoes, there were nothing like the smooth, mild tubers you'd recognize today. They were small, knobby, and packed with toxic glycoalkaloids, a chemical defense against being eaten by anything at all. Andean farmers didn't just tame this plant. They engineered an entire food system around it. Through generations of careful selection, they bred out much of the bitterness and toxicity and developed thousands of distinct varieties. Some accounts put the number at over 4,000, suited to different altitudes, frosts, and soil types. They also solved a problem that would matter enormously later. How do you store a crop that rots within weeks of harvest? Their answer was chuño. Potatoes freeze-dried using the natural cycle of Andean nights, which drop below freezing, and days, which are intensely dry and sun-scorched. Farmers would lay potatoes out, let them freeze overnight, then stomp the water out of them by foot the next day, repeating the cycle until what remained was a light, wrinkled, almost indestructible food that could be stored for years. Chuño fed Incan armies on the march and filled state storehouses as insurance against bad harvests. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, the potato wasn't a wild curiosity. It was the nutritional backbone of an empire. The Inca state itself was, in a very real sense, built on the reliability of this crop. And it's that same reliability, transplanted 5,000 miles away, with none of the accumulated knowledge that made it safe, that would eventually turn catastrophic. The Spanish weren't interested in the potato for its own sake at first. They wanted silver. But ships don't sail empty, and sailors need food that survives a months-long ocean crossing without rotting. And it turns out a plant already engineered by Andean farmers to survive drought, frost, and long storage was exactly what a 16th century galley needed. The potato crossed the Atlantic almost as an afterthought. Europe had no idea what it was about to receive. You'd think a calorie-dense, easy-to-grow root vegetable would be an instant hit in a Europe that had just spent centuries dealing with recurring famine. Instead, it took almost 200 years for the potato to go from botanical curiosity to dinner staple. And the resistance it faced tells you a lot about how societies actually adopt new foods, which is, reluctantly, and only when they run out of other options. Part of the problem was the potato's own family tree. It belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly nightshade itself, and European farmers who'd never seen it before were not wrong to be suspicious. The green parts of the plant, and any tubers exposed to sunlight and turn green, really are toxic. Rumors spread that potatoes caused leprosy. Some clergy declared the plant unfit for Christians because it isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. In parts of France, potatoes were fed only to livestock, and eating one yourself was considered a mark of poverty or desperation. It took a mix of scientific persuasion and outright royal theater to change European minds. In France, an army pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier had eaten potatoes as a prisoner of war in Prussia and became convinced they could solve French famine problems. His most famous trick: he got permission to plant a field of potatoes outside Paris, guarded by soldiers during the day, to make the crop look valuable and worth stealing, then withdrew the guards at night, all but inviting the locals to steal a crop they'd otherwise have refused to touch. It worked. He's also credited with convincing Marie Antoinette to wear potato flowers in her hair at court, turning what had been peasant livestock feed into something fashionable. Prussia took a blunter approach. Frederick the Great, worried about recurring grain failures and the vulnerability of a kingdom that depended on a single crop, issued direct orders for peasants to grow potatoes, reportedly threatening to cut off the noses and ears of farmers who refused. Legend has it that when peasants still resisted, he had potato fields planted and guarded, deliberately, to convince suspicious farmers the crop must be worth protecting, and therefore worth growing themselves. Whether every detail of that story is accurate or embellished over time, the underlying strategy was real. European monarchs increasingly saw the potato as a tool of state security, a hedge against the wheat and rye harvest failures that had triggered famine and unrest for centuries. And the math behind that strategy was genuinely compelling. Potatoes produce far more calories per acre than most grain crops. They grow in poor soil that wouldn't support wheat, and they're largely immune to the kind of weather that wrecks a grain harvest. A family working a small plot could grow enough potatoes to feed themselves and their livestock on land that would have produced a fraction of that in wheat. For a continent that had lived through repeated famines, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across northern Europe before the potato ever arrived. This was close to a miracle crop. By the late 1700s, the potato had gone from suspicious nightshade to essential staple across huge stretches of Europe. Population growth in Ireland, Prussia, and parts of France and the Low Countries tracked closely with potato adoption. Historians have argued that the crop may have added tens of millions of people to Europe's population over the following century, simply by making more calories available per acre of farmland than ever before. There was also a demographic ripple effect that historians still debate the size of, but not the direction of. More reliable calories meant fewer seasonal famines, which meant lower infant and child mortality, which meant more surviving children, which meant more hands available to farm even smaller plots of land, as those plots got divided among heirs generation after generation. In Ireland specifically, this cycle pushed rural families onto increasingly tiny parcels of land, sometimes less than an acre per household, where only a crop as calorie-dense as the potato could plausibly keep a family fed at all. Nowhere did the potato become more central to daily survival than in Ireland. And that centrality, that near-total dependence, is exactly what would make the coming disaster so catastrophic. But what happened next in Ireland wasn't simply an unlucky harvest. It was the collision of a fragile monoculture, a colonial land system that left millions with almost no alternative, and a government response that some historians today argue amounted to policy failure dressed up as fate. To understand how a plant disease became a humanitarian catastrophe and a political turning point for the entire British Empire, we need to look at exactly how dependent Ireland had become and why. By the 1840s, roughly a third of Ireland's population depended on the potato for almost their entire diet, and for the poorest tenant farmers, that dependence was close to absolute. Under a land system controlled largely by absentee British and Anglo-Irish landlords, most Irish tenant farmers rented tiny plots, often just an acre or two, on which they grew grain and livestock to pay rent, and potatoes to actually feed their own families. The potato made this brutal arithmetic survivable. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for close to a year, plus livestock, on land too poor or too small to grow enough wheat for the same purpose. Irish farmers had also overwhelmingly settled on one variety, the Irish lumper, prized for its high yield in poor soil, but genetically almost identical from field to field across the entire country. That genetic uniformity, which had seemed like a strength for generations, became the single greatest vulnerability in Irish agricultural history. It's worth pausing on just how total this dependence had become by the 1840s. Estimates from the period suggest that many Irish laborers ate somewhere close to 10 to 12 pounds of potatoes a day, alongside buttermilk, as their near-total source of calories. This wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the direct result of a land system where the best farmland grew cash crops for export and rent, while the smallest, poorest plots, the only land many tenant families actually had access to, could reliably support human life growing almost nothing else. In the autumn of 1845, a fungus-like pathogen called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland, most likely carried on shipments of American or continental European seed potatoes. It causes what's known as late blight. Plants that look healthy one week can be blackened, collapsed, and rotting within days. Because nearly every Irish potato field carried the same genetic vulnerability, the blight didn't just damage the harvest, it devastated it nationwide, almost simultaneously. The first year's crop losses were bad. Somewhere around a third to half of the harvest failed. But 1846 was worse. The blight returned with even greater ferocity, destroying nearly the entire crop across the country. And it kept returning, in patches, for years afterward. Families who had planted their entire survival strategy around one reliable route now had nothing. What turned a crop failure into a mass death event was the response, or the lack of one, that actually matched the scale of the crisis. Britain's government at the time, heavily influenced by laissez-faire economic thinking, was deeply reluctant to interfere with markets, even as people starved. Some initial relief efforts, like imported American corn nicknamed Peel's Brimstone for its yellow color and the difficulty of cooking it without proper equipment, were canceled or scaled back as the crisis deepened, on the theory that government aid would distort markets and discourage private charity and trade. Later relief schemes leaned heavily on workhouses and public works projects, building roads that led nowhere, for instance, simply to justify paying starving laborers a wage instead of giving direct aid. Conditions inside the workhouses were often so poor and disease spread so easily in overcrowded quarters that entering one could be almost as dangerous as staying outside and going hungry. For many families, the workhouse became a last resort that arrived too late to matter. Meanwhile, and this is the detail that still generates fierce historical debate today, Ireland continued exporting food throughout the famine. Grain, butter, livestock, and other agricultural products left Irish ports for Britain even as people starved just miles away, because those exports were tied to rents and contracts that tenant farmers couldn't break without losing what little land access they had left. Whether this reflects deliberate cruelty, catastrophic administrative failure, rigid ideology, or some combination of all three is still argued over by historians. But the outcome is not in dispute. People died of starvation and of the diseases that follow it, like typhus and dysentery, in a country that was still shipping food out of its own harbors. By the time the worst of the blight years had passed, around 1852, Ireland's population had fallen by roughly a quarter. Death estimates for the famine itself generally land around 1 million people, though the true number is difficult to pin down given the chaos of the period. Somewhere over 1 million more emigrated, many to the United States, Canada, and Britain, often on ships so poorly provisioned and disease-ridden that mortality during the crossing itself sometimes reached 20 or 30%. This is where the grim nickname Coffin ships comes from. Ireland never fully recovered its pre-famine population. Emigration continued for generations after the immediate crisis ended, driven by the same land pressures and lack of opportunity that the famine had exposed so brutally. Some counties in the west of Ireland still, to this day, have not returned to their pre-1845 population levels. The famine's consequences didn't stay contained to Ireland, and they didn't stay contained to the 19th century either. The wave of Irish emigrants who landed in American and Canadian port cities carried more than just hunger and grief. They carried a hardened resentment toward British rule that would shape Irish-American political identity for generations. Irish-American communities became a major source of funding and political organizing for Irish nationalist movements back home, including groups like the Fenian Brotherhood, which staged armed raids and agitated openly for Irish independence from bases in the United States. Within Ireland itself, the famine became a permanent, radicalizing memory, proof, in the eyes of many nationalists, that British governance was fundamentally indifferent to Irish lives when it mattered most. That grievance fed directly into the land reform movements of the following decades, and into the broader nationalist and independence movements that would eventually produce Irish self-governance in the 20th century. It's not an exaggeration to say that the political road from a blighted potato field in 1845 to Irish independence in 1922 is a fairly direct one, even if it took nearly 80 years to walk. The famine also permanently reshaped how governments think about food security and monoculture risk. The lesson of a nation brought to catastrophe by dependence on a single crop variety wasn't lost on agricultural policy for the rest of the century. Though tellingly, it would take further crop disasters elsewhere in the world before genetic diversity in staple crops became a serious policy priority rather than an afterthought. And the potato itself survived all of this, more central to global food security today than it has ever been. It remains one of the most produced food crops on Earth, feeding well over 1 billion people, valued for exactly the same traits that first won over suspicious European farmers centuries ago: reliable yields on marginal land, and more calories per acre than almost anything else you can grow. The very qualities that made it Europe's miracle crop are the same ones that, concentrated into a single vulnerable variety on a colonized island, helped produce one of the deadliest famines in modern European history. Modern potato breeding has, in a sense, spent the last century and a half trying to correct the exact mistake that devastated Ireland. Today's major growing regions typically cultivate dozens of distinct varieties rather than relying on one, precisely because plant scientists learned, at enormous human cost, what happens when an entire food supply rests on a single genetic line. China and India are now the world's largest potato producers by volume, a fact that would have seemed unthinkable to the Andean farmers who first domesticated the crop, or to the European monarchs who once had to threaten their own subjects into planting it. So the next time you see a potato, in a grocery store, on a dinner plate, wherever, it's worth remembering what this root actually is. Not just a side dish. A crop that helped build empires, that toppled the myth of guaranteed harvests, and that, in the space of a few terrible years in Ireland, proved just how dangerous it can be when an entire nation's survival rests on a single root in the ground. There's a strange kind of irony sitting underneath all of this. The same qualities that made the potato so attractive to Andean farmers, then to Prussian kings, then to French pharmacists trying to end famine. Reliability, density, ease of growth on marginal land are exactly what made it so dangerous Once an entire nation staked its survival on one narrow genetic strain of it. A crop bred for resilience became, in the wrong conditions, a single point of failure for millions of lives at once. That tension between efficiency and fragility didn't end with the Irish famine either. It's the same tension agricultural scientists still wrestle with today. Every time a modern food system leans hard on one high-yield variety of wheat, banana, or rice, and hopes nothing comes along to test it. If you want more deep dives into the foods that quietly shaped human history, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.